collective witness of the New Testament to Paul includes a variety of images. Paul the persecutor, Paul the convert, Paul the evangelist, Paul the pastor, Paul the defender of the gospel, Paul the letter writer, and Paul the theologian. What we have in 1-2 Timothy and Titus is best described as Paul the mentor. Even though this trio of letters has, since the 18th century, gone under the collective title the Pastoral Epistles, not exactly an inaccurate designation, they might more fittingly be named the Mentoring Epistles. In these three letters, we're given the picture of Paul trying to fortify his theological vision in the churches and making his final pleas to his two trusted colleagues, Timothy and Titus. It's not too much to say that these three letters convey something of Paul's anxiety and concern for his junior co-workers, his continued confidence in their ability, combined with warnings for them to heed, a strong sense of personal warmth towards them, coupled with grave admonitions to guard the gospel, all while basking in the glory of King Jesus. Situating the pastoral epistles in Paul's career is complex, because these three epistles are disputed as to their authenticity. Many regard these three epistles as pseudepigraphical, with the result that their account of Paul's ministry derives from either latent memory or else would be a literary invention. We'll explore those issues of authorship in a moment. It suffices for now to say that whether historical or imagined, the letters describe a scenario where Paul survived a first imprisonment in Rome and then engaged in a period of ministry, writing 1 Timothy and Titus along the way. Then sometime shortly after, he entered a second imprisonment in Rome, where he was again facing a capital trial, upon which occasion he wrote 2 Timothy. There are several ways of understanding the authorship of the pastoral epistles, and they range from pseudepigraphy all the way to authenticity. First, the pastoral epistles are frequently identified as a form of pseudepigraphy, either a deliberate forgery or else a pious fiction, with Paul writing to his beloved sons in the faith, Timothy and Titus. There are several reasons for ascribing pseudepigraphy to these letters. First, the Greek language and style is a little bit different. The pastoral epistles contain a distinctive vocabulary, with 176 words that are used here but not found elsewhere in the New Testament. And there's 130 words that are not used in any of the other Pauline letters. Some scholars allege that the Greek vocabulary of the pastorals is more indicative of Christian language in the 2nd century, which had a propensity to adopt pagan religious terminology from the Roman imperial period. While stylistic arguments for authorship is not as determinative as often thought, in the case of the pastorals, especially concerning Titus, they do have some credence. Second, there's Paul's movements. There are difficulties in squaring Paul's movements described in the pastoral epistles with what we know about Paul's travel ambitions stated elsewhere. The pastorals narrate how Paul experienced a first Roman imprisonment, a first offense from which he was purportedly released, but thereafter he's depicted as traveling back to Macedonia, Achaia, Western Asia, and maybe even Crete. But if Paul, as he says in Romans, believed that his work in the northeast quadrant of the Mediterranean was finished, and his intention was to head further west to Spain via Rome, not to zigzag across the Adriatic and Aegean seas, then we've got a problem. Because Luke's narration of Paul's farewell speech to the Ephesian elders in Miletus is also dramatic and poignant because, as far as Luke was aware, this really was the last time the Asian believers would see him. Luke was writing probably a decade or more after Paul's death, and he would have known about another trip to Ephesus if Paul had made one. And third, there's Paul's opponents. The deviant doctrines described in the pastorals have the character of a Jewish teaching that is heading in a Gnostic direction, something which fits very well in the 2nd century, but might not be completely mappable into the pre-70 AD period. Fourth, we've got the apparent early Catholicism. It's often claimed that the churches of the late 1st and early 2nd century gradually became less spiritually animated and socially egalitarian, and they morphed into hierarchical institutional forms, ostensibly known as early Catholicism. This early Catholicism is typified by established offices of overseer, bishop, and deacons, and also by a spiritual expression that was controlled by ecclesiastical authorities. Now, the pastorals refer to the distinct office of elder, or equivalent to overseer or bishop, and then you've got the subordinate office of deacon. And these office holders are apparently appointed top down by apostolic succession in the ordaining of elders and overseers and bishops through the laying on of hands. And so it is alleged that this scheme of church order has more in common with the Ignatian letters of the early 2nd century, where authority is centralized in a single bishop, which is then said to be in contrast to the undisputed letters, which exhibit a strong belief in the collective teaching authority of the congregation, which emphasize grace gifts given to all members, and there's a strong egalitarian ethos as a whole. In particular, the egalitarianism of the Pauline congregations, where women were able to prophesy and teach, is thought to be eclipsed through a very patriarchal vision of leadership. Fifth, we then have the orthodox eulogizing of Paul the martyr. Another feature of the pastorals is that they offer a portrait of Paul that looks like a later generation of the proto-Orthodox church, venerating the Apostle Paul as the ideal convert, as the creator of true doctrine, and as the ideal Christian martyr. These letters presume upon an established set of doctrines known as the faith and sound teaching, which look like later formulations of the rule of faith. Here, Paul is more than an itinerant teacher of a messianic sect, but his memory has become enshrined as the true and faithful teacher of the Gentiles. Now, I should add that regarding the pastorals as non-Pauline in authorship does not necessarily mean automatically dismissing them as fraudulent compositions. Although the pastorals may not be directly from Paul, they still lay claim to the direct voice of Paul himself, even if the Pauline legacy has been extended and transformed to address issues in the post-Pauline era. The Pastoral Epistles then could represent a fusion of Pauline tradition and post-Pauline interpretation to reflect fresh developments in the life of the church. So much so that pseudepigraphy is an adequate account of their origins, contents, and usage. Okay, a second option is that the pastoral epistles were based on Pauline fragments that were then redacted and added to a Pauline letter collection by a follower, someone like Luke. While the pastoral epistles might appear to be post-Pauline in language and style, there are also segments that sound authentically Pauline. For example, concerning Paul's approaching death, we read this: "For I am already being poured out like a drink offering, and the time for my departure is near. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Now there is in store for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day. And not only to me, but also to all who have longed for his appearing." Now, if that is not Paul's own words, one can easily imagine him saying something very much like that as he approached his death, especially in light of similar passages where Paul contemplated the end of his life. Consequently, one wonders then if the pastoral epistles might be made up of fragments of Paul's personal notes, or maybe shorter letters that have been expanded into 3 distinct epistles and then added to the Pauline letter collection as a kind of, posthumous capstone. A compiler might have had access to Paul's creedal summaries, Paul's statements about his life and work, his prison experiences, or maybe even his travel notes about his Asian ministry, all of which were then combined and embedded in these pastoral epistles. Added to that fragmentary hypothesis is the observation of many scholars who have postulated a connection between Luke and the pastoral epistles, with Luke acting as either a secretary or a redactor. Now, the benefit of this hypothesis is that it explains the biographical references, including how Luke alone was with Paul in Rome, and it comports with the convergence between Luke Acts and the Pastoral Epistles on topics like Christian ministry, Christian attitudes towards the state, Christology, eschatology, conversion language, and the overall parody of Luke's portrait of Paul with the pastorals. Third, others are of the mind that 2 Timothy is authentic, while 1 Timothy and Titus are not. That is because the style and vocabulary of 2 Timothy on the whole is closer to the undisputed Pauline letters, whereas 1 Timothy and Titus are closer to each other in style, but they're very different to 2 Timothy and to the undisputed letters of Paul. Moreover, 2 Timothy is more of a personal encouragement to Timothy, whereas 1 Timothy and Titus appear to be mandating somewhat wooden responses to the perceived problems of church order in Ephesus and Crete, respectively. This renders 2 Timothy the more personable and perhaps the more credible letter among the pastorals as an authentic Pauline writing. A fourth option is that Paul actually wrote the pastoral epistles. The case for Pauline authorship of the pastorals largely rests on accepting their self-witness as credible and refuting the arguments against their authenticity. In regards to the style of Greek and the language, there is the genuine issue of difference here. However, there are also other factors that should prevent us from automatically assuming pseudepigraphy as the explanation for the differences in vocabulary and style. First, it's worth remembering that non-Pauline words occur most frequently when dealing with the false teachings and the qualifications for church leaders, which are not addressed in the undisputed Pauline letters. Second, the vast majority of the letters attributed to Paul usually involve a co-sender or secretary, and yet no one seems to refer to the epistle of Paul and Sosthenes to the Corinthians, the epistles of Paul and Timothy to the Corinthians, Philippians, Colossians, and to Philemon, the epistles of Paul, Silvanus, and Timothy to the Thessalonians, or the epistle of Paul with Tertius' assistance to the Romans. Added to that, Ephesians is probably a circular letter, dependent upon the framework of Colossians. Only Galatians lacks a co-sender or scribe. If the co-senders or scribes shape the language, content, structure, and style of the authentic Pauline letters, then they cannot be used as a control sample of pure, pristine Paulinism to be contrasted with the pastoral letters. Third, it's notable that whereas the other Pauline letters are addressed to churches, even the epistle to Philemon includes the entire church addressed there, the pastoral epistles are the only instance of private correspondence written by Paul to an individual, which gives further reason as to why they might be different from the other Pauline letters, which are addressed to churches and their assemblies with their many needs. The problem of Paul's movements can be resolved fairly easily. After release from a Roman captivity, Paul either abandoned or suspended his plans to visit Spain, and instead attended to pressing needs in Greece and Western Asia. In due time, Paul dispatched Titus to Crete and left Timothy in Ephesus, writing to them both from perhaps Miletus or Macedonia. After a short span of 2 years or so, he somehow returned to Rome, either voluntarily or under arrest, where he was again imprisoned. He wrote 2 Timothy from Rome and was finally executed by Nero sometime in the mid-60s. One should not too quickly assume that the pastorals describe a post-Pauline or even a post-apostolic period of church life. To begin with, while many like to situate the pastoral epistles under the slippery moniker early Catholicism, this entity is a chimera. In scholarship, early Catholicism is used to designate the ecclesiastical settlement reached between the warring Paulinist and Petrine factions in the early church. It's used to describe a wing of the church that came to be characterized by a waning expectation for the imminence of Jesus' return and charismatic energy being eclipsed by emerging hierarchical structures, also imbibing Hellenistic perspectives, adopting Stoic ethics, and the solidifying of beliefs into wooden doctrinal forms. One cannot help but notice that early Catholicism appears to be a punitive category used by liberal Protestants to describe how Christianity drifted from its original moorings into something closely resembling the ancient Catholic Church of Alexander and Ambrose that they are disinclined towards. I doubt whether Luke, Clement of Rome, Ignatius of Antioch, or Polycarp of Smyrna possessed all the dichotomies and developments attributed to early Catholicism by these scholars. Furthermore, one could argue that the church life of the pastorals fits neatly into Paul's ministry and does not require postulating a setting in the post-Pauline period. It's often claimed that Paul was an itinerant leader who established communities typified by spiritual vitality and charisma, with only loose and ad hoc leadership arrangements in place. Whereas the pastoral epistles assume structured and hierarchical models of community where spiritual displays have been muted and claims to charismatic authority have been cloistered. That assumption is undermined by a few things. First, the organisational scaffolding that Paul erected within his communities relied on household structures for leadership, or else utilised the scheme of elders and deacons, which is not out of sync entirely with the pastorals. The pastorals are also a far cry from the mono-episcopacy of Ignatius, or the detailed instructions about church order we find in later writings like the Didascalia or the Apostolic Constitutions. Second to that, religious movements rarely evolve in a neat linear fashion from charismatic to institutional. In reality, organisational development tends to be constantly in flux, diverse, contingent upon local circumstances, and often adopting fluid models of leadership. Third, 2 Timothy does not deal with church structure at all. Only 1 Timothy and to a lesser degree Titus are concerned with leadership roles. Even then, they mainly address the character and conduct of leaders, not institutional power, nor the transmission of authority, not even episcopal legitimacy. The alleged theological developments of the pastoral epistles from the Pauline letters can also be overstated. Although the pastorals do exhibit features that look like post-Pauline confessional terminology, references to God our Saviour, nonetheless, there is a tight agreement with central Pauline motifs like the centrality of grace, the inclusive scope of salvation, the transformative power of the gospel. They're all there as well. If Paul did not write this, then an imitator has certainly done his homework. Also, while the pastorals stress guarding the deposit of sound doctrine, the faith, even in the undisputed Pauline letters, we find similar emphases on the word, the faith, the teaching or instruction that believers have received and are meant to continually preserve and pass on. The pastorals do not envisage the transfer of authority and doctrine as found in later centuries, but merely emphasize preserving the gospel, the apostolic interpretation of Jesus' death and resurrection, a natural and expected accent to find as Paul approached the end of his life. One could also argue that Paul's opponents in these letters bear some resemblance with the recurrent problem in Paul's career of Jewish groups with proselytizing agendas. Several of the problems addressed in the pastorals are germane to previous disputes pertaining to privileged accounts of knowledge, abstention from marriage, and erroneous configurations of eschatology. Even the prohibition of women teaching men in 1 Timothy 2, however we understand it, is not completely out of kilter with Paul's efforts elsewhere to ensure that women did not disrupt the order of worship, like in 1 Corinthians. In which case, it could be said that the pastoral epistles fit well into the period around the death of Paul and the transition to the period in which he was no longer there to lead the congregations which he had planted. In brief, if the pastorals are authentic, then they were composed across the mid to late 60s, with 1 Timothy and Titus probably written from Macedonia after Paul's release from his first Roman imprisonment, and 2 Timothy composed in Rome during a second and final Roman imprisonment. Otherwise, if the Pastorals are based on Pauline fragments that have been redacted and added to a Pauline letter collection, then a date in the late 1st or early 2nd century is a plausible time for their inclusion in a popular edition of a Pauline codex. Alternatively, if the pastorals are pseudonymous, then a date as late as the 160s is possible, with the letters written in response to a pool of growing Gnostic heresies that climaxed in Marcion. On Paul's opponents in the pastorals, one cannot assume that the teachers whom Paul criticized in Crete, that's in Titus, or Ephesus and 2 Timothy, were one and the same. Nonetheless, there does seem to be several homogeneous traits ascribed to the false teachers across all 3 letters, including deception, promoting controversy, rejecting sound teaching, and engaging in unconscionable behavior. By way of summary, the Pastoral Epistles confront deviant theologies. They censor these demonic doctrines, and they highlight the dangers of an unhealthy interest in controversies. The false teaching is clearly rooted in Jewish soil. It's associated with the Torah, including the purity laws. It's associated with the circumcision group. What is more, these deviant theologies are attentive to Jewish myths and genealogies, which involve a rewriting of the creation story. They exhibit a strong asceticism and seem to possess an over-realized eschatology where the resurrection has in some sense already happened as an inward experience. And these teachers seem to have a confidence in something falsely called knowledge. There are perhaps even shades of docetic Christology that is confronted. If we marry these teachers' devotion to the Torah alongside interests in myths, speculations about the creation story, a rigorous asceticism, and an internalized eschatology, and an emphasis of knowledge, we may surmise that we are dealing with a variant form of Jewish teaching that is headed in a Gnostic direction. A type of incipient Jewish Christianity that Hegesippus says evolved into several Gnostic sects, the type which underlies the Gospel of Thomas and morphed into the heretical teachings of Gnostics like Basilides and Corinthus and others. The purpose of the pastorals must be explained with respect to the intentions of each letter and their utility as a collection as a whole. The letter to Titus urges Titus to remain in Crete, to continue to instruct the young church, to assist Zenas and Apollos on their travels, and it requests Titus to winter with Paul in Nicopolis. 1 Timothy is an encouragement to Timothy to remain in Ephesus and to establish the orderliness and orthodoxy of the assemblies there. 2 Timothy is very much Paul's testament. He asks Timothy to keep the faith, to join him in Rome, and to bring John Mark with him. As a distinct collection, the pastorals constitute the final account of Paul's apostolic labors. They're an encouragement to keep the faith and an overall guide to church order and discipline.
The 2 letters to Timothy and the letter to Titus are often referred to as the Pastoral Epistles. They present us with a different kind of challenge. The style, particularly of 1 Timothy and Titus, is quite different from Paul's other letters. Not different in the same way as the 1st and 2nd letters to Corinth are different, but different in tone and in the use of key phrases and in the overall structure of sentences. People have brought in computers to try to assess the stylistic differences, but the results from that sort of experiment are uncertain, partly because the small size of the sample makes it difficult to judge. Most scholars really have problems seeing Paul as the author of these letters. A further problem is that the small personal notes about the movement and location of Paul's associates can't be made to fit in with Acts 13 to 28. It's possible, despite what Paul said about having finished work in the Eastern Mediterranean, that he did in fact make another trip there after his trial in Rome. If so, then perhaps those details might be made to fit there, but we would have to do that navigation without any help from Acts. The 2 letters to Timothy are themselves very different from one another in both style and character. The first letter moves from topic to topic, not entirely unlike 1 Corinthians, which does that. Timothy has been left behind in Ephesus, apparently, as a teacher, and he must give himself to that work, urging mutual love, resisting false or deluded teachings, stressing the constant duty of prayer, and in particular, taking care over the selection of persons to hold leadership and teaching roles within the church. And the letter draws to a rhetorical conclusion by looking ahead with joy to the royal appearing of Jesus. That language echoes things that were said at the time about the Roman emperor. But the actual conclusion is yet more practical teaching. If there are rich Jesus followers, they are not to idolize their riches, but they are to use them for the common good. Then there is one more flicker of a warning. There is out there something called knowledge, Greek gnosis, which is gaining ground in the community, and this must be resisted. Paul, or whoever wrote this letter, could hardly have guessed how large a problem this was to be 100 years later, as some of the greatest Christian teachers at the end of the 2nd century fought hard against the gospel-sapping theories of Gnosticism. The second letter to Timothy is written from prison, and it seems as though the writer knows his time is near. He reflects on his past work. He celebrates the central truths of the gospel, reflecting that though he is in chains, nothing can tie up God's word. Bad times will come, and false teachers too, and folk will listen eagerly to people who tell them what they already want to hear. But the example and teaching of the truth must be maintained. Paul, if it is he, sounds tired at the end, urging Timothy to come to him soon, certainly before winter. There is a hint of a sequence of trials, 4 verses 16 to 18. So far, Paul has escaped being thrown to the lions. That's in 4:17, though the idea of being thrown to the lions may just be a metaphor for some great disaster or just perhaps execution. But this may not last much longer. In other words, Paul reckons his day may be coming. This is a deeply personal letter. It feels somewhat rambling, but it is full of passion and faith and deep affection for the younger man Timothy. If it's hard to fit its details into any Pauline itinerary that we know of, it's actually hard to imagine someone other than Paul writing in his name in so personal a fashion. The short letter to Titus assumes that Paul has left him, Titus, in Crete. Again, this doesn't fit with the itineraries that we know from Acts. So if the letter is genuine, we'd have to assume a substantial further period of work in the central Mediterranean region. As in 1 Timothy, one of the important things will be the appointment of church leaders, choosing particularly people who will be able to address the problems which occur in the local culture. Church members must be reminded again and again that part of the point of the whole Christian movement is to be a family that engages in good creative work in the wider community. That's what's meant by the phrase good works, which occurs again and again. What matters, what is going to create the best impact for the gospel, is if this otherwise strange and apparently subversive family is seen to be making their street, their village, their town a better place. Disputes and divisions are inevitable, but so far as possible these are to be avoided. They will eat up energy and do nobody any good.
Putting the pastoral epistles into practice is relatively easier than some other books of the New Testament, because these 3 epistles call us to pastoral service with teaching, training, and mentoring. First, the pastorals demand that we guard the gospel and the whole evangelical tradition of the church. Paul is anxious that every teacher of the faith should know how to build up the community in mutual love and support, rather than by the wrong set of teaching or behavior tearing it apart. We know even today, with 2,000 years of history, how easily things can seem to fall apart. How much more fragile must the little churches have seemed in those early days, with tiny communities facing huge problems and challenges. An antidote to that is to ensure the integrity of the evangelical and apostolic foundations of any church. Second, the pastorals are not inanely doctrinaire or reducibly dogmatic, but they abound with an emphasis on doing good deeds and living a life of faith. When I first became a Christian, I was discipled by a young pastor of a young church who took me under his wing and instructed me in the way of Jesus Christ. When it was time for me to leave town to move on, he and his wife gave me the gift of a theology textbook with the following words inscribed in it. Watch your life and doctrine closely. Persevere in them, because if you do, you will save both yourself and your hearers. That's the word of 1 Timothy 4:16. That is advice we must all follow if we're to run a good race. It's not enough to have good doctrine. One must be devoted to doing good things. That's precisely what's emphasized across the letters. If we follow the example of our best leaders, then we will in turn be an example to others. And the people whom Jesus redeemed in order to purify for himself are people that are his very own, eager to do what is good. Third, the pastorals are a robust reminder about the importance of mentoring. Making yourself irreplaceable is a great way of ensuring job security. However, a good leader is always trying to manufacture his or her own redundancy by ensuring that there is someone of character and competence ready to take over from them. True leaders think 2 moves ahead, a decade ahead, a generation ahead, and they make sure they have trained the people who can lead the church with its ministries in the years to come. The pastoral letters remind us that we need to identify, train, mentor, and encourage our Timothys and our Tituses, as well as our Phoebes and our Priscillas, to pick up the baton from us and carry the mission of the church forward. There should be no ministry without mentoring your successor.